Okay, so I'm going to start off case and address the disadvantage, and then I'm going to move back on case to kind of reinforce why our advantages hold and why you should vote in favor of the government to pass this plan. So the first disadvantage that came out of the Leader of Opposition speech was the economy. And the main point, to summarize, was that since we're recovering from a recession, it is not the right time for companies to have to pay more money for their fuel because passing a cap and trade will increase fuel prices, since the point of the cap and trade is to reduce carbon emissions. Okay, so there are a couple of ways to answer this. One is that what the Leader of Opposition doesn't mention is that cap and trade policies are actually in place in several states in the United States right now. So there's a group of states in the Northeast, Connecticut, Delaware, Vermont, Rhode Island, there's 9 of them, anyway, that currently have cap and trade policies in place. In addition to California, that's a really big state, and Washington just passed it. So California's has been in place since 2012, and its economy has still been doing fine. It hasn't crashed and burned. It's the hub of innovation. It's not a place where businesses are dying. And 2012 was still very deep in the recession when this was passed. So there's no link to the plan passing and us falling right back into a recession or companies not being able to afford the new framework under a cap and trade policy, because we've seen that there's actually examples of states that have successfully carried out cap and trade policies. The other point that I wanted to bring up is that the United States has recently had a shale gas and shale oil boom. So yes, it's true that coal has made up nearly half of our power generation over the past decade, or past century. But now as coal-fired plants are beginning to be retired, natural gas plants are coming online because natural gas is so cheap due to all the success in fracking in Texas and North Dakota especially, that natural gas is actually going to become cheaper than coal. And so companies will probably end up moving off of coal anyway, not just because of the carbon emissions, but just because of economics. As your disadvantage says, economics is very important. So with the natural gas boom and all the coal-fired plants that are slated to be retired because they are old and they do date back to a long time ago when we weren't worried about carbon emissions, this change is probably something that will happen and is economical. We're just speeding up the time frame to get things moving and see these advantages more quickly. That kind of ties into the second disadvantage. I'm going to move on now to disadvantage 2, which is innovation. And the point of this disadvantage is that if we pass the cap and trade plan, startups will fail, and thereby, instead of helping innovation, shoot, I forgot to set my timer. Does someone timing this?
Do you want to just
Can you just tell me when it's over?
Oh.
So he says startups will fail and will kill innovation, thereby defeating the purpose of a cap and trade policy. However, I'd like to take this and give it to you in a different light. The only startups that will fail under a framework that discourages carbon emissions are startups that are producing carbon emissions. And those are not the kinds of startups we want to encourage. We're looking for clean energy startups. So I'm going to turn this disadvantage. Good. If the startups that are producing too much carbon to pay for it fail, good. That's what we want. We want companies to start, we want to support companies that have green, renewable energy. And so if the inefficient startups are failing, that's fine. We're going to encourage people to innovate in a different way and build their systems to be energy efficient and green. And that way they're not going to be adversely impacted by a carbon cap and trade policy because they're not going to be producing excessive emissions. In fact, they'll benefit from this because they can sell on the sell side of the carbon taxes and actually get some more money and thereby succeed with additional funding as opposed to the status quo. Which brings me probably to like 3 minutes and I still have time to talk, so I'm going to go back on case. So now that we've seen that the opposition doesn't really have any disadvantages that stand up against this plan, I'm going to go back on case and remind you of all the reasons why you shouldn't just not vote for their plan, for their side. You should vote actively for the government. So the first thing we talked about was the environment. And I'd just like to go back to the environment because under the opposition's framework, we do nothing. We stay in the status quo. However, as my partner mentioned, status quo is not something we can really afford to stay in. We have to take action. The United Nations set, under the Kyoto Protocol, which was kind of what expired, a goal of increasing global temperature or carbon emissions by only 2% per year or something like that. Anyway, we far exceeded it. So within the next 30 years, we're going to hit our carbon emission quota. And that's very dangerous. So something has to be done. You can't not act. And what the opposition is proposing is that we not act. We don't pass this carbon cap and trade policy because possibly some businesses will be adversely impacted. So we should do nothing. However, within 30 years, every business will be adversely impacted because we're going to be living in an environment that is no longer safe for humans to inhabit. So I would say that this is not outweighed by any of his disadvantages. Even if they had stood up, you're going to vote for us on the environment because something needs to be done, and they offered no counterplan, no alternative framework. So on a net benefits criteria, even if there are some downsides to the government's plan, you're still going to vote for the government because doing nothing is far worse than doing something that, even if you reduce carbon emissions by 1%, is an improvement and net beneficial to the environment. Okay, the second advantage was revenue.
Government revenue from collecting taxes from it.
Okay, is that the government gets some revenue by collecting taxes. So obviously getting government revenue is good because we're in running a $14 trillion deficit, and so we need to pay some of that back to give our investors some faith in the United States government and to continue to fund important projects within the United States, such as infrastructure. I'll move on to that advantage now. The money that we get from this cap and trade policy is going to be put back into infrastructure. And so it's been widely seen in developing and developed nations that countries that spend more on infrastructure tend to be more successful. There is a strong positive correlation between good infrastructure and spending of at least 5% of government budget on infrastructure and success. So the United States doesn't spend as much on infrastructure as it should. As my partner already said, we've got crumbling dams. There was an infrastructure spending plan passed by Obama during the recession, but that was mainly used on highways and roads. We need to spend our infrastructure on other things as well. Rail is very important. Dams, as he said, bridges are falling to pieces. So all of these things are very important to keep our country running and keep it running safely. So you're also going to vote for the plan because the plan does something about our crumbling infrastructure, whereas the opposition prefers to just let the bridges fall apart and let cars fall into the water. So vote government.
Case, and leaving me a nice hole to take advantage of. For Jay for stepping in at late notice to help me out. Of course, for our coaches for being here, and for you, of course, being open to learning. So, I will go off case first, so cover the disadvantages first, and then get on case later. So let's begin. Disadvantage 1, economics. Cap and trade does a lot of good things, and yes, I will acknowledge that something does need to happen. I would have run a counter plan if this hadn't been sample debate. But what the government fails to emphasize, which I'd like to point out, is the time frame in which this cap and trade is being implemented. And so, as my opponent pointed out after I asked the question in the first speech, cap and trade is going to be initiated January 1st, 2015. That's just over a quarter away. Now, going into what happens with business planning, especially for large corporations, they tend to plan many years in advance. Of course, the biggest corporations have 10-year plans, 5-year plans, and 2 and 3-year plans, 1-year plans. No one's taking this into account. It's coming out of nowhere, and regulation that's being passed and implemented so soon is going to blindside everyone. It's going to blindside the major players, and it's going to blindside the startups. And so flowing back across everything I said from my economics perspective, or economics disadvantage, that's all based on the time frame of this argument. And what I basically said was that this decision and these regulations are going to hit everyone so quickly and so hard that that's what's going to cause the economic collapse. And so the spike in prices, because none of these corporations were able to build that into their pricing schedule, is going to cause massive inflation for consumers. People aren't going to be able to buy basic necessities, and businesses aren't going to be able to afford the inputs for their production lines. So, yes, our opponents talk about cap and trade that has been put in effect in 9 states. That's 9 out of 50. It's less than 20%. And so we're still going to be hammering over 80% of our states with new regulations that they aren't equipped to handle. Yes, shale oil has been the rage for the past couple of years. Natural gas is growing in popularity, but it isn't popular now. It isn't in place now in order to take over the energy needs of our country, in order to make up for the very rapid reduction in carbon emissions that's going to be necessary in order to sustain our economy. And so, again, we can flow back all of my economic disadvantages leading to ultimately starvation, increase in unemployment rate, businesses going out of business because of the short time frame in which this is enacted. Now, moving on to my second disadvantage, innovation, I'd like to point out that, let's see. So my opponent said that the only startups that will fail are the ones that aren't green, and we want them to fail because we only want green startups. And I'd like to flow over what I said about the economics disadvantage in saying that everyone is going to be affected by this because the price of every single good is going to increase dramatically and unexpectedly. Everything is somehow affected by the price of oil because of transportation costs, powering your building, any manufacturing process is affected by the price of oil and other carbon-emitting processes. So what that's going to do is it's going to cause an increase in price for not only green startups, or not only polluting startups, but also green startups. And so they're not going to be able to get off the ground because they won't be able to afford the basic inputs for their business. So they're not going to be able to afford the electric bill in order to power their offices. They're not going to be able, if they are manufacturing, to afford the inputs for that manufacturing process. And so again, we're going to be stifling innovation from a startup perspective, and then we're also going to be stifling innovation from a corporate perspective, large businesses such as GE, BP, and whatnot, because they won't be able to afford the basic inputs because prices are going to rise across the board. And so going to flow across all of my innovation disadvantages that I don't remember because I didn't write them down. So, going on case to their environmental advantage 1. So my opponent says that we have to take action. If we don't take action, the entire country is going to, or the world is going to go up in flames, and we're going to be in huge trouble. We're going to be in huge trouble starting January 2015 if we don't take, if we do take this action, and that action is, or those negative impacts are going to be immediate. We may even be experiencing the impacts in advance of January 2015 in anticipation of the price increases. So I didn't offer a counterplan, forget what I just said. So our opponent said if we don't act now, we're going to be impacted even more later on. I'm saying that if we do act now in the time frame that's given, we're going to be so adversely impacted that we won't be able to innovate for the future. We won't be able to come up with more efficient processes. We won't be able to even be able to employ our own population. So that's going to result in immediate negative impacts, which I went through in my disadvantages and also touched on in the last speech that I also didn't write down. Now, a note on this, my partner may come up and say that the cap and trade won't cause unnecessary burden on businesses. And so they're stuck in catch-22 where either their plan, because no numbers were laid out in the speech. So either their plan isn't restriction or doesn't impose restrictions on business, in which case it does absolutely nothing to curb carbon emissions, or it does impose restrictions on business, which, as I laid out in my previous advantage, is going to hit businesses so soon, so hard, that it's going to cause economic collapse. And so they're caught in the middle where either their plan does nothing and they don't achieve any of their impacts that way, or their plan overextends, it does too much, and it ultimately does damage. And so, normally I would argue for a counter plan, some other way to, or a better alternative, but because I didn't introduce the counter plan, they either do horrible things or nothing. Going on to their second advantage, revenue, and their third advantage, infrastructure, I'm going to lump those two into one and address them together. Basically, because of the economic collapse which is going to happen, they won't have increase in tax revenue because businesses and individuals won't have any income to pay the taxes. And then again, with the infrastructure, because they won't have this tax revenue, because they won't have this income, they won't be able to fix the bridges, they won't be able to fix the roads or the dams or the oil pipelines or anything else. And so the government doesn't have to pay down the debt, and actually it's going to increase the federal debt because they're going to have to introduce a new stimulus bill in order to get us out of the recession that we're going to plunge into because of the economic collapse. And so turn all of their advantages for, or their impacts for advantage two, because the government's going to have to spend more money in order to dig us out of the hole. And then you can sever the links in their infrastructure advantage because they don't have the money to fund it. So for these reasons, I urge an off ballot. Thank you.
So thanks everyone for coming. It's been a great debate. On their first advantage, the first thing I want to start off with is that they don't really have any voters for you to actually, or any reasons for you to actually vote for this plan, right? So the first thing that they say is that it will help the environment, but as my partner addressed, that the hit to the economy because of the suddenness of my opponent's plan will actually cause a reversal of innovation, and it will limit the amount that companies can do to actually invent innovative technologies that will, in the long run, address a lot of the environmental problems. So because of the suddenness of my opponent's plan, that will actually hurt the environment. He turned that against them, and that also links into our innovation disadvantage. So you see two voters there. One, the long-term environment will actually be hurt because of the lack of innovation caused by the economic shock of the government plan. So turn the environment advantage and also extend the innovation disadvantage. Those are combined with each other. On to the revenue thing. Once again, this links into our economic advantage, and they also tie this into the infrastructure spending too. So as my partner said, lump these two together. The revenue will be limited by the economic shock. Not only that, but he turned this as well, saying that because of the economic shock that the government plan is guaranteed to cause, it will actually cause an increase in the deficit, and once again, we won't have money to spend on infrastructure. So really, all their arguments are turned by the suddenness of their plan, right? So in the long run, we should be looking at what's beneficial, and the government plan is just causing too much of a shock to the system. Also, on their pretty much all their advantages, this is a new argument, and I shouldn't be doing this in this speech, but I feel like it's important. You don't really have to address it in your next speech. But I think they have an inherency issue, because what Katya said was that it's happening in all these states, and also that people are already switching from coal to shale, so why even do the plan? And they have an inherency problem, because why should we do a sudden plan that's going to cause an economic shock and hurt innovation when it's already happening in the status quo? She said 9 of these states have already switched to
Just say non-unique.
Yeah, non-unique.
Okay, it's non-unique. It's the argument. It's the argument that I'm making. Why do the plan whatsoever? Why implement a plan on the 1st of January, of 2015, when we could just continue on with the status quo and keep the system that's already, as she admits, is already working. We're already switching from coal to shale, and it's already these systems are already being implemented by the states. So on to the next side, I already addressed how these disadvantages tie into their advantages. So I'm just going to go over it again. The economic collapse is really the biggest voter that you're going to vote on here, because of the suddenness of the government plan. It will hurt the economy. That will have the most immediate impact and prevents all the impacts that they have from their plan. So it turns the impacts that they have, and it also has immediacy. So that should be prioritized in the debate round, and that should be the biggest thing you're going to vote on. Is that a plan that's causing shock to something that's already gradually happening in the United States will actually hurt the economy, and it will hurt innovation in the long run. Like you said, the prices of goods will increase, so you could turn that whole it'll hurt green startups from happening, because the price of goods will increase will make it difficult for any startups whatsoever. So vote neg on economy, innovation, and that the plan is already occurring status quo.
To give you guys a quick roadmap of where I'm going, I will cover everything I possibly can on off case, moving on case, and somehow now I have like the super advantage. Instead of having 3, there's only 1, and then we're gonna go to voters at the end here. So this got progressively messier. Alright.
The super advantage.
Anyway, my opponent noted that we would be doing too much too soon. Sorry. My opponent noted that it would be too soon and that the cap and trade plan would be too much and thus it would punish the economy. Businesses aren't planning for this, however, this isn't true. Any good business would have a plan that includes something such as a cap and trade system, which has been in consideration by the US Congress since the 90s. It was actually part of a plan proposed by the Heritage Foundation as well as Republicans in order to save the environment. If you're not keeping track of current events as a business, you're an irresponsible business owner, and so they will have had this. In addition, the cap is not overly restrictive. Part of this goes back to not having specific numbers of the cap, but you can make it so that the cap is currently 90% of carbon emissions, and then you can steadily lower it as time goes on. My opponents like to paint this picture where it's all of a sudden like, oh, you can only emit nothing. Like, that's not what we're doing. Like, that would just be really weird. That's not how it works. My opponent noted, and then they brought up in the rebuttal abusively, it was abusively in the rebuttal, it was fair in there, that natural gas is not in place. Disorganized here. My opponent tried to claim that natural gas was not in place now. However, the plan provides an incentive here for natural gas, extending out this current argument. Natural gas is only marginally in place. This plan would provide an incentive to increase that. In the rebuttal, I'm addressing it on the dissent 1 because that's just where I scribbled it. There's this immediacy, inherency problem. However, this is abusive, and so I don't have to address it. If I were going to address it, I would say that some change here, and in fact a faster change, is better than no change at all, just having hands off, let natural gas take its course, however long that might take. However much we can incentivize it and reduce carbon emissions is a good thing. In the final constructive, my opponents noted that businesses can't afford this, it's stifling innovation, and they said that GE and BP won't afford this. GE paid 0% in taxes 2 years ago. I'm pretty sure they have enough capital on hand in order to afford this system. In fact, GE has been actively lobbying Congress for this system. So GE wants this, and in fact it would be a great benefit to them because they've already acted under the assumption that the plan were in place. These smart businesses which have planned to have additional credits that they can sell off to worse performing businesses in order to make extra money. So GE sees this actually as a revenue source. So that turns the only thing that they have on their advantage. Moving on case, this is sort of complex because there's like a super advantage here now, but my opponent said that either plan does nothing or plan does horrible things. There's no link here, that's a false dichotomy. The plan can have a nice middle ground where carbon emissions are slightly reduced, revenues are slightly raised, the environment is moving on to being saved, the economy isn't destroyed. There's no reason that you have to pick between these two absolute extremes. In addition, in the rebuttal, they noted that the lack of innovation would tank the environment. This is a new argument. You have to discard it completely from your flow. They did not address any of my impacts on Advantage 1, meaning that you have to drop that completely. Again, they mentioned this inherency, non-uniqueness problem. That's a new argument. You got to strike it from the flow too. Okay, moving on sort of to revenue. My opponent noted that there would be no income, there would be this economic collapse. We've turned this time and time again by noting that the plan would not be as restrictive as my opponents falsely claim. My opponent also claimed in the rebuttal that we would need a new stimulus bill, new link. We never said that anywhere. There's no reason to think that would be the case. Advantage 3, infrastructure spending. My opponents let this sail right on through because they combined it in revenue. That was some sort of trick to make you think that it was going to be addressed when really it wasn't. So infrastructure sails through pretty much untouched. The only thing they said was that there's no money to fund it, but you can flow over our arguments from their disadvantage 1 and our disadvantage 2, because that was only mentioned in their second constructive speech. And then it was dropped. Voters here. Really quickly, there are 3 of them. 1, we work to save the environment. The status quo is really bad. The temperature is increasing, as I mentioned last week. They bite it. They take all of that harm. We dodge all of that harm. Point for the government. Our impacts outweigh theirs. Number 2, innovation. We encourage more innovation through allowing these startups to produce innovations that make cleaner technologies. These are the sorts of innovations we want, not the innovations that would harm our environment. Finally, voter 3, our impacts outweigh theirs. We save the environment, promote future life. They do not, all they do is say like, well, we can't act because that would put us in a recession. For all these reasons, we strongly urge a pro-ballot and urge the adoption of the government's plan. Thank you.